My baby dolls, we're all back again for another episode of Genesis. As always, I am your host, Ian Kahanowitz, and today we got another great show for you coming up. My partner, Marc Weiss, my sidekick, the man with the plan, the man that is the co-captain, the co-chairperson of this show. He's running around in Arizona somewhere during spring training trying to get folks on the show. We'll let you know how he did on the next show when we do the inquiry on him and see how he liked spring training. But today we have someone very special. I love his story. One of the best stories you're going to hear about a blind man who was able to become a announcer. And you're asking me, how the heck did that happen? And I'm going to tell you, you're just going to have to listen to the show. But before we get to Mr. Don Wardlow, and I love him, he's in a lot of my groups. I know he has a few of his groups out there on Facebook, and very, very knowledgeable on the baseball scene. And, of course, he's been doing it for a heck of a long time. You are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with Ralph Tycho, the Zigzag Man. And it's an honor to have my show, Genesis, on the network. And, go to the network, tune in. We've got a lot of programs out there, including Peter Golenbach, a very illustrious author of many, many books. He has his own show. We got Ronnie Rabinovitz, who was Jackie Robinson's friends. We got Dave Nemec's Old Style Baseball, which I've been initiated in along with Alan Bumpkin, and we're going to have a great time on the network. And we do try to educate you folks as well as making it entertaining. And my guest today, he has been in baseball, like I mentioned, for a very long time. We're going to get his story, and I don't want to even tell the story because I'm going to let him tell the story. But without any further ado, welcome to the show, Don Wardlow. How are you today, sir?
Doing very well, Ian. How about you?
Me, it's fantastic. It's about 40 degrees in Massachusetts. I don't know if you watched the World Baseball Classic, and of course you can't watch it. You got to listen to it. But the United States just broke my brackets there. I thought the Dominican Republic was going to take it against Puerto Rico, but what you think of the Americans there?
I think they got a lot to be proud of because there were a lot of talking heads that were putting down the American team because they didn't have Madison Bumgarner, they didn't have Jake Arrieta, they didn't have any of the pitchers from the Mets, DeGrom or Syndergaard or any of those guys. And the talking heads who think they know so much, they said, the Americans can't win because they don't have all those people. America doesn't care about the World Baseball Classic. Well, America showed that even with their second-line people, Marcus Stroman, who pitched the game against Puerto Rico for the finish, Marcus Stroman, they had Tanner Rourke, they had in the early rounds Chris Archer. Even with those guys, they beat the rest of the world.
Let me ask you this, Don. I always loved Jim Leland. I loved him going back to the Pirates era back in the early 90s when I was a big Yankee fan like you are, but I was kind of like all excited that the Braves were coming up. And those Pittsburgh teams did challenge the Braves in those years. And then, of course, he won with the Florida Marlins, and he went on to Colorado and then Detroit. What do you think about his style of managing? You think he had to do a lot of work for these kids, or do you think that the team just gelled?
Well, the team worked for him. The team understood Jim Leland. They knew the legend that is Jim Leland, that he's been managing forever and a day, and they were certainly lucky to have him in the first place. And they marched to the beat of his drum.
Let me ask you this question. He's going to be 73 this year, Leland. He was born in 44. You think he should go back to managing after this nice run in the World Baseball Classic?
Well, now, I'm not going to judge, anybody, whether they should or whether they shouldn't. It's a matter of they've got to look deep into their soul. He's got to look deep into his soul. He's got to, look at what his health may be. That's certainly not a matter of public question, but he has to pray over it, and if he feels that he should throw his hat in the ring again, then, that's entirely up to him. I would hire him to manage my team tomorrow. But that's,
I love Leland.
Grind 162 games, even the way they do it, even with charter jets, you're still going from coast to coast. It's not, anything easy for a man of 73 years. But I say I would hire him in a minute.
Let me ask you this question on the upcoming baseball team season. Which teams do you think are going to be in the hunt for playoffs this year?
Well, not the Yankees, that's for sure, because the Yankees have Zippo in the pitching department. They desperately needed pitching, which they didn't get. They've got all the hitting coming up. They got young hitters who are going to be very good, eventually, but it would help if they weren't behind 5-0 in most of their outings, which is what's going to happen with the pitching they've got. So I'm looking at several of the teams that were in the hunt last year. I'm looking at Cleveland. I'm looking at the Cubs. I'm looking at the Dodgers. I would, if you really meant it, I'd say Cleveland. If I had to put my money down, that's where I'd put it.
I think it's going to come down between Cleveland and Boston. I like what Boston's did with the pitching, picking up Seeley and plugging the holes. And plus they had, Big Poppy. He just retired. What designated hitter, retires with near 40 home runs, a .315 batting average, and driving in over 100 runs? Then they had a hitting team, Boston. I am definitely not a Boston Red Sox fan. I follow them because I live in Massachusetts. Like you, I'm a huge Yankees fan. But I will tell you about when I do think about the Yankees. I like their hitting. I think getting Holiday and having these young kids are very good. The pitching could be acceptable. I think Sabathia might have a fourth wind to at least get through the season, and then of course they're either going to trade him or dump him because his contract's up. I think Tanaka, if he could stay healthy, is fine. I think Michael Pineda, if he stays healthy, they're going to be fine. Luis Cervino, again, if he stays healthy, and I do like Adam Warren, that he came back to the Yankees from the Cubs, and possibly could be a fifth starter there. The bullpen is stellar between Betances and Chapman. So the Yankees, although they're in a rebuilding phase, if they get a pitcher and if they can plug the hole at shortstop for the next 6 weeks while Gregorius is injured, they take a run just to get into the wild card game, I'm thinking. What's your thoughts on that?
That'd be about as far as they could possibly get, and that would require Sabathia to stay sober, A, and Tanaka to stay injury-free, B. Those are the two humongous things. And even if he is sober, Sabathia might win 10 games at the most. He's quite old, and he's had quite a lengthy run as it is. So, he can't go on forever. Big Poppy did the smart thing because Big Poppy doesn't want to be the next Willie Mays, who stayed on too long, or pitching-wise, the next Steve Carlton, who stayed on too long. Big Poppy left when he was still, as good as he had been the last few years. He didn't want to be playing and hitting 220 instead of, 260 or 270 and hitting 10 home runs instead of 40. He wanted to be remembered at his best, and he left at his best.
Yeah. Everyone, like you mentioned, Willie Mays. In 1973, it was pretty much, a show of watching Willie Mays on the Mets. And, I even think Derek Jeter might have stayed a year or two too long in to the game because, in the end, his average stock, Mantle stayed in too long. He should have quit right after the 500th home run just to watch a batting average drop like that. It's, it was awful. But let's talk about your and let's get right to it. And let's talk about your condition and what happened when you were born and what this condition is that you have, and why it's so important to at least some people of this condition.
Okay, I have been blind since birth. What they found when remember, this was 1963. This was a long time before sonograms. Today they could look and they could see if a baby didn't have any eyes, like I don't. They couldn't do anything about it, but they could at least see it on the picture. But in '63, that wasn't known until I was born. When I was born, the doctor told my family in the very few minutes, they said, this baby has no eyes. And that, was a big jolt to the family. There were 4 of them before. There was my brother and 3 sisters. I'm the youngest of 5 kids. So, but they all pulled together, and the way I've been told the story, my dad got the family together and said, well, we're all going to raise this baby. This isn't just going to be, mom and dad's baby. All of you are going to play a part. You're all going to talk to him. He's going to come to know your voices. Even before he's old enough to talk, he's going to know who you are and things like that. And they set a goal to raise me as much of a normal child as possible. And that was more difficult to do in the 1960s than it would be in 2017. But it was done anyway. My parents were determined to see it done, and they were put in contact with the New Jersey Commission for the Blind, an organization which still exists to this day and still does what it set out to do, which is, help parents with babies who are born blind, and then help the children with their education, get them the equipment that they need. And what's a more challenging thing for the commission to do is to help blind adults like myself to find work. And they do try. There's not a ton of success in it, but they do try. So I've been a client of theirs since really, very shortly after I was born. I've been a client of the Commission for the Blind.
Let me ask you this, Don. If you were born in 2017, 2016, would have circumstances been different for you? Would they be able to have the technology to operate?
Not to my knowledge. The condition has a scientific name, bilateral anophthalmia, which means that you have no eyes on either side. Bilateral means both sides. So I don't have either a left eye or a right eye, and there's no nerves to connect anything to. There's just nothing. The only difference is that they could see it on a picture from the inside now, and they could at least prepare the parents, to say this is how it's going to be with your child. That's the only difference as far as I know. And then, of course, there's more toys in 2017 that are sound equipped that person with no sight can play with. There were fewer of those toys in the 60s, and the family had to improvise. I best remember having a very big ball that had a bell in it, and I could bounce it, I could roll it around, I could throw it to someone if they wanted to play catch. Other things that were not adapted that I just learned how to use as they were the little Matchbox cars. I was a big fan of those Matchbox cars, and we had bare floor, no rug, in a good chunk of the house. So I had a improvised raceway from the far end of my mom's sewing room, and it ran straight down the hall into my parents' bedroom. It was all bare floor, like I say. So I would match up the cars, and I'd race them to see which one would go the furthest. And that would work great, except for weeks when my dad was on night shift. Then the door to the bedroom would be closed, so that would close the track.
Wow. And let me ask you this. Growing up, you listened to probably the TV and the radio, and when did you start developing a love for sports? And by the way, we know you did baseball, but you love all kinds of sports.
Yes, I do. I've dabbled in broadcasting football, boxing, basketball, very, very little of each of those. I could never make any money at any of them. I made money in baseball. But the funny thing is, my love for baseball came about by accident. My dad wasn't a baseball fan in particular. My brother wasn't especially a baseball fan, and by the time I discovered baseball, my brother was in college, so even if he was a fan, he wouldn't have been able to, do much with me baseball-wise because he was in college. He lived away from home. But the accident worked like this. I was listening to the country radio station. I've always loved country music. And that radio station was WJRZ out of Hackensack. And in between the country songs, they would have ads for the Mets games. And the Mets games had a song then which had a lot of banjos behind it. I've always liked my banjos. And the song went, meet the Mets, step right up and greet the Mets. Well, that song really got me. And they would say, tune in Saturday for the first spring training game of the Mets. And you hear all the banjos in the background. And so I figured, well, now Saturday, when the game is, I'm going to listen to that and see, what the Mets thing is all about, what baseball is all about. Well, slowly, very slowly, I've learned the game of baseball from the Mets broadcasters at long range, Lindsey Nelson, Ralph Kiner, and Bob Murphy. All three of whom are in the Hall of Fame. Slowly I learned there was 3 outs to each inning. There was 2 halves to each inning. There was 9 innings to a game. And from my dad, I learned that there was 162 games in a season, and that it was a very, very, very long season, and that you better not get worked up over any individual game. He said, if you're going to get worked up over one game, you better root for something else other than baseball. Because baseball, you have to judge by the whole season, not by one game. And Dad taught me that young, and that was a lesson that it took some learning, but I got the hang of it eventually. And I realized that football, you get more wrapped up in one individual game. Baseball, you go by a series, you go by 10 or 20 game stretches. If you go on a bad losing streak, that could affect you for the whole season. But that was an early lesson from my dad.
And something, I do remember that song because I used to watch Kiner and Lindsey Nelson and Bob Murphy, and I think it continues saying, bring your kiddies, bring your wife, guaranteed you'll have the time of your life.
Oh, sure. Yep. And my dad, even though he wasn't a baseball fan, he pulled off a miracle in 1972. He took me to my first Mets game, and what I didn't know was that he had written a letter to the Mets PR man, Jay Horowitz, and that letter essentially said, my son is blind, he's 9 years old, and he is a big fan of the announcers, even more than the players. Would it be possible for him to meet the announcers? Well, Dad didn't say anything to me about that, because what were the chances it was actually going to happen? So we're at the stadium, and he says, well, we can't go right to our seats. We kind of have to wait for a few minutes. There's a little delay. So, we stood there, and I had my hand on his arm, and darn if Lindsey Nelson doesn't come up and, hi, Donnie, something of that nature. I was 9 years old, so everybody called me Donnie. And after Lindsey Nelson, here's Ralph Kiner. Here's a glad hand, another, hi, Donnie, how you doing? I don't remember what I said. It couldn't have made much sense. And the last one was Bob Murphy, the man who I have credited with being, my professor of baseball. And again, the glad hand, it was just amazing. And I didn't have to walk to my seats after that. I could fly after meeting those guys.
Well, and like you mentioned, and they probably, what the good thing about Murphy, Lindsey Nelson, and Ralph Kiner were, because I did watch them on WOR TV, Channel 9, and I watched PIX with Frank Messer and Rizzuto and White. All 6 of them were fantastic announcers. Even if the Mets were bad, or if the Yankees were not playing their best, and of course the Yankees had more luck at the end of the 70s, Who wouldn't want to watch Kiner's Corner? You know, I mean, that's huge.
Hey, he was a very funny man, Ralph Kiner was, and so was Richie Ashburn in Philadelphia. There were a couple of funny guys in the broadcast booth.
Yeah, I like that. I like Richie.
Murphy and Nelson could educate a kid, even a blind kid, and get you to understand baseball. And my grandpa was a big help with that. Once he realized I'd gotten into baseball, my grandpa weighed in because in the 20s and 30s he had worked for one of the railroads, and the railroad would give their men Yankee tickets one time a year, and he could take my dad, which was his only son, he could take him to Yankee Stadium. And Grandpa would tease me. He'd say, the Mets are a bunch of beginners. The Yankees have been around forever. Now, what I didn't know was that he was teasing, but he was telling the truth. I found out the Mets had only begun in 1962, as I did a little growing up, and I did a little studying up on the game. And Grandpa would talk about the players from the 20s, like Walter Johnson, Ty Cobb. His favorite to talk about was Grover Cleveland Alexander. He may never have seen him because Grover pitched in the National League, but Grandpa, told tall tales about him, and he'd say that he could pitch a game, go drink a beer, and then go pitch a second game of a doubleheader. And now I thought he was just joking. As I got older, I found out that in the 20s, pitchers could and sometimes did pitch both games of a doubleheader. And if it was only a beer, that was mild for what some of them might have been drinking.
And Alexander, probably, I'd say for about 5-6 years, he was that dominant, if not as dominant as, say, Walter Johnson was in the American League. But let me ask you this. Go ahead.
He wanted me to know the history of the game and how great it had been in his day. And he also got me into baseball cards so that I would know who the modern players were on all the teams, not just the Mets and the Yankees. By having baseball cards, I knew who was on the Brewers, who was on the Twins, even though they played 1,000 miles away. So when they would come into town, and the Yankees or Mets would play. If the Mets had played the Cubs, I'd know who at least some of the Cubs were. I'd know who Ernie Banks was and Don Cassinger and whoever I had on baseball cards. I'd at least know the name when Bob Murphy started to talk or when Lindsey Nelson did.
Now, growing up, did you go to a special school to high school, or you went to the public school systems in Jersey?
That's the beautiful thing. Mainstreaming was just coming in. My parents, in fact, thought I was going to end up in a school for the blind, either in Boston or in Philadelphia, and they didn't like it, but they thought it was inevitable. But the State Commission for the Blind said, "Oh, there's this thing mainstreaming. He can be in regular school." And by that time, my mom had already learned Braille. She thought she would have to, write me letters at blind school, so she learned Braille. And she and my aunt jump-started me on learning my ABCs in Braille before I went into school, so I'd have a little bit of an edge on everybody else. All through my school years, the commission had a counselor that would come see me and make sure I had my Braille machine in order, make sure it wasn't broken, make sure I could keep up with the work. They began teaching me to type when I was 8 years old on a regular typewriter, so I wouldn't have to just do Braille. I could do, on typing on a regular typewriter, so everybody could read what I was writing.
And then you did you go to, you went to Glassboro State College, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yes, I did, and that was, I'd made a discovery in high school that was vital to my college education. I had discovered college radio. And I discovered that on college radio, on the Columbia station, on the Fordham station, on the Seton Hall station, they all broadcast baseball. And from March until the end of May, if you were lucky, if your team made it to the regionals, as Seton Hall did in those early years, I was able to listen to a great deal of baseball. And these were young broadcasters. These were college guys. And I was thinking, I'm only a couple of years younger than that, and I'm going to go to college. So when I go to college, I'm going to go where there's a radio station where they broadcast baseball. I mean, if somebody can do play-by-play, I can do color. Because when you're hearing the best of the best, when you're hearing guys who are going to go to Cooperstown, you never think, I can do that. You never think that when you're hearing Bob Murphy, when you're hearing, the best of today's John Miller. There's no contest there. But you hear John Miller, and you say, I can't do John Miller. I can't be like him. But if you're hearing college guys who are only a couple of years younger or older than you are, and they're making mistakes, they're making fumbles that Bob Murphy would never make, I said, I could do that. I could be like Michael Kay, who I was hearing on the Fordham station, or I could be like Charlie Slows, who I also heard on Fordham, and Charlie is one of the voices of either the Nationals or the Rays. I can't remember right now, but I have it written down. But I heard Charlie, I heard Michael, I heard Matt Lachlan, who broadcasts the Jersey Devils now. He was the sports director of the Seton Hall station the year that I discovered college ball. And so I figured I'm going to be a college broadcaster. I wanted to be a disc jockey. I was not a visionary, and I'm still not a visionary. I can't see what's coming around the corner. By the time I got out of college, you couldn't really be a disc jockey. The stations were getting their music from satellites. So I figured my radio career was done after I got out of college. But college is where I met Jim Lucas, who was my broadcast partner for a while. Then once Jim opened the door for me, and once it got clear that Jim and I could do broadcasts, then other announcers who'd been reluctant to work with me before were willing to step forward and do games after Jim had left school.
And let me ask you this. You guys did something remarkable for about 7 years before you even got a gig. Why don't you explain what you guys did?
Yeah, starting with college and then carrying on, after college, we would take our recording equipment, broadcast a tape recorder, a couple of microphones. Jim got a mixing board, really primitive one, but a mixing board. And we'd plug those mics in, and we'd have sometimes we'd have a Braille machine. And we would broadcast games from Yankee Stadium, from Shea, and from Veterans Stadium in Philadelphia. We would do them just into a tape recorder. And early on, we were just doing them just to be doing them. We didn't think we'd seriously, make a rally and become professional broadcasters. But along about 1990, Jim said to me, we're as good as we'll ever get unless we try and take that next giant leap, unless we try and go pro. We were both working at regular jobs, going to games on our off nights and off days and weekends and all that. And he said, we can't get any better doing this. We have to decide, do we want to be professional announcers or do we just want to spend the rest of our lives working? So we got a bunch of blank tapes, short blank tapes. Everything was on cassette then. And we made demo tapes. We made 176 copies of the same demo tape. And we wrote 176 letters because there were then 176 operating teams, starting with the majors, going all the way down to rookie ball in the Appalachian League. So we sent 176 letters. 30 of them, we got back form letters. We got 13 relatively nice letters saying, well, we don't need you, but keep trying. And we got one special letter, very special. It was from Mike Veck, and he ran a team then operating in Pompano Beach called the Miracle. They were an independent baseball team in the Florida State League. And Mike Veck, who we found out was the son of Bill Veck, the famous baseball promoter, Mike said, why don't you come down and do a game on the radio on our station. You do 8 innings out of 9. Our people will do the first inning. And in that way, Mike could get publicity for the team, and we could get on-air material for our next demo tape, so we might have a shot somewhere for 1991. So this was in July of 1990. We went down there, and we did that ball game, the Miracle against the West Palm Beach Expos. And we, as I say, we got our on-air footage, and Mike got a whole lot of very good publicity for the team, you know, for bringing on a blind broadcaster, at least for a night. And the Miracle at that time needed all the publicity they could get. So we were happy, and Mike was happy. It was a classic win-win situation.
And why don't you describe, or actually tell us, who Mike Veck's father was?
Okay, Bill Veck was in baseball as early as 1937. His dad was one of the owners of the Cubs before the Wrigleys got the team. And Bill Veck planted the ivy on the walls out there in Chicago at Wrigley Field in the 1930s. And then he became a team owner in his own right. He almost got hold of the Phillies in the 1940s. In 1943, he made a run to get the Phillies. That didn't work out, but Bill got a hold of the Cleveland Indians, and he was their owner in 1948, the year they won their last World Series. He brought Larry Doby and Satchel Paige into the big leagues with the Cleveland Indians, and they were the two first black American League ball players after Jackie Robinson had broken the color line over in the National League. So, but Bill then went over to the St. Louis Browns, where he brought a midget up to home plate, Eddie Goodell, and that stayed with Bill for the rest of his days. And of course, Mike Veck, Bill's son, heard all the stories of Eddie Goodell and how Eddie came up to home plate as a publicity thing for the St. Louis Browns. And Mike, when he got old enough to get involved in baseball, he got a hold of the Miracle. He and a bunch of other investors got hold of the Miracle, and this was just about as bad a team as you were ever going to see. Their first half, they won 15 games, and they lost 54 in 1990, and that was the year that he invited Jim and I to come down for one game in July. And we did that, and Mike didn't make us any promises then, but he said, make sure you're at the next winter meetings in Los Angeles. And we had, again, more demo tapes, and we went to Los Angeles, the only time I've ever been there. And there were exactly 3 possible jobs out there. There was the Miracle, Mike's team. There was Boise, Idaho, and there was Pocatello, Idaho. Both of those in the Pioneer League, which is rookie ball, which is up there with the Appalachian League. And by the end of it, we had been offered jobs by Boise and by Pocatello, and Mike was still saying, well, it's a very good possibility. You know, he didn't make us a firm offer, but he said, if I could get radio, you're coming to Pompano Beach. You know, you can forget Boise and you can forget Pocatello if I get radio, Mike said. So we waited to mid to late January, and Mike said, go ahead and tell Boise that you'll take it. I can't get a radio commitment. So I called Ken Wilson in Boise, and I said, you know, we're coming your way. You know, tell us when to be in Boise. You know, we'll join you. So he said, so get to Boise mid-May. So we prepared to do that. I told my bosses at the job I had that I'd be leaving in May to go to Boise, Idaho. Well, beginning of February comes around, we get a call from Mike Veck. And Mike says, I've finally gotten a yes from this radio station. I want you guys big time. And I'm like, well, let's see. There's two choices. Pompano Beach, Florida in February or Boise. Didn't seem like much of a choice. We did get the man in Boise pretty angry with us. He thought we were using him to get more money out of Mike Veck, but that wasn't true because, if anything, Mike was paying us less. But he was offering us two things that any young broadcaster would like. He was offering us Florida, and he was offering us 140 games as opposed to 76 games, which is what the Boise team and the Pocatello team play. They play 76, where the Miracle played 140. So that was a giant inducement, along with Florida itself, which, as I said, would entice any man in his 20s. So we took the gig in Florida. We moved to Pompano Beach right around Valentine's Day that year, at 91. And come April, the red light went on in our booth, and it was all real. We were broadcasting the Miracle against the Fort Lauderdale Yankees, which had a number of future major leaguers on their team. We had a few of our own future major leaguers, but theirs were more impressive than ours, and they took us 2 out of 3 in that first series.
And that first job, Don, that took you. Now you continued to send away tapes, I believe, and you ended up in all places of New Britain, Connecticut.
Yeah, that wouldn't have happened except that Mike Veck, after our second season, Mike said, you're right now you're a Veck creation. He said, you have to try and go on your own. See if you can get a job with somebody that's not Mike Veck. See if you can get out from under my shadow. So Jim looked around, and he found one AA team that hadn't broadcast baseball in 1992, and that was the New Britain Red Sox. So rather than sending out a whole lot of tapes, Jim approached New Britain directly. He went to New Britain. I was doing high school football down in Florida with another friend of ours. So while Jim went to New Britain, and he talked to Jerry Berthiaume and Joe Buzis, the two chief executives of the New Britain team, and Jim said, how about radio? You didn't have radio in 1992. What would it take for you to have radio in 1993? And Jerry said, we're not going to have radio in 1993. We're not going to pay for it. This is an awful team. Nobody's going to listen to it, so why should we have it? So the way Jim approached it was, he said, well, you don't have to pay for it. Jim said, we meaning he and I, he said, we can sell the commercials, we can arrange a radio station, and we can make this work as independent contractors. And Jerry said, well, if I don't have to pay for it, then, and if you guys can find a station, then you're on. Which left Jim a couple of daunting tasks. One was to find a radio station that would carry a perfectly awful baseball team. The Red Sox had lost over 90 games in 1992, but Jim approached radio station WBIS in Bristol, Connecticut, and their man, Jim Huber, went along with Jim Lucas, my partner, and said, yeah, you can have it, $75 a game. So and that was a great deal less than what I found out Michael was paying down in Florida for the games. Jim Huber was very kind to us to do it for $75 a game, and that was his price that year, and that was the price in our second year in 1994.
And let me ask you this, Don. Somehow, along the way, you got to announce a Major League Baseball game.
Yes, in starting in, I believe, March or April of that year, of '94, our second year with New Britain, we had contact from the Florida Marlins. Now they're Miami, but they were the Florida Marlins then. They were in their infancy, their second year. And they were looking for a way to get a little publicity going on. And they said to Jim, what would you guys think of coming down here and doing a couple of half innings of one of our broadcasts? And we jumped at the chance, obviously. And we, along with doing our regular broadcasting for New Britain, we did a lot of prep and a lot of study of the Marlins and the Chicago Cubs. And I did a lot of brailing of a lot of stats for players on the Marlins and the Cubs, because our big day was going to be a Thursday afternoon game, 23rd June 1994, when the Cubs were going to be in Florida. So, as I say, somehow I worked in all the brailing I would have to do for those Marlins and Cubs for that game, along with our regular 140-game slate for New Britain. I, to this day, don't know how I did it, but I worked in one way or another. And come June 23rd, there we were in the broadcast booth, and we were waiting for a signal from Joe Angel, the broadcaster of the Marlins at that time. And he was going to introduce us for the bottom half of the third inning. That was the first of our 3 half innings that we were given. And I had all the paperwork, and I had talked to John Miller earlier in the year, the Orioles broadcaster of the day, and John had said, whatever you do, be prepared beforehand. He said, if you don't have it with you, you're not going to pick it up in the booth. So I studied and crammed, and I knew those notes as well as I knew anything else in all the world. I knew what I had in front of me. I knew the best stuff I was going to use. All I was waiting for was a signal from Joe Angel. Those first 2.5 innings, for me at least, seemed to take 2.5 years. But finally, we got to the bottom of the third, and he threw it over to Jim and myself, and away we went. It was absolutely beautiful. We did the bottom of the third, we did the top of the fifth, and we did the last of the seventh. Unfortunately, nobody scored in any of those innings. But from then on, we could say we had a cup of coffee in the major leagues. And among other things, I met Tony Perez, who had played for the Big Red Machine, and he was in an executive capacity with the Marlins at that time. And that was a great thrill. As much as doing the broadcasting, meeting Tony Perez was a great thrill. I got to meet Gary Carter, in a similar, I got to meet Bob Murphy for the second time. We had done a press conference in New York a couple of days before our game to let the world know what was going to happen. And at that time, I met Bob Murphy for the second time. And I told him about our meet and greet back in 1972. And I knew he was going to Cooperstown. I asked his permission to do an interview with him before he went into Cooperstown. And so he gave me a date and time and a phone number to call. And this, after our major league game, this was a few days after, I called him up and we did that interview, and that aired on the last day of July 1994, the day he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. So a lot of good things.
Fantastic. Wow. Now let me ask you this. You guys, we could listen to a few broadcasts from you when we make a trip to Cooperstown. Which games are those, and why was it put in Cooperstown?
Well, they have, the Cooperstown Library has one game of mine featuring Mariano Rivera. He pitched for the Fort Lauderdale Yankees in 1992 against our team, the Miracle, who were then based out of Fort Myers and still are. Mariano struck out 12 of us, and they beat us 1-0. course, my grandmother could have struck out 12 of our guys. We didn't know then who Mariano Rivera was. Nobody knew who he was. And in fact, a year later, he had arm surgery, and everybody figured that was the end of Mariano Rivera, that he would never be heard of again. Well, you and I know the history after that Mariano became the best closer the game has ever seen. And when his career was wrapping up, I contacted Jeff Idelson at the Hall of Fame, who I had met on one or two occasions. And I said to Jeff, I've got this recording from 1992 of Mariano pitching against our Miracle with me on the broadcast. So you have a blind broadcaster and you have the best closer the game has ever seen. Would you like to have it as a donation to the Hall of Fame library? And God bless him, Jeff Idelson said, sure, I'll have it, by all means. And earlier on, he had asked for another game of ours. Back when I first met him, he asked for just a random game, just so he could say he had a game of the first blind broadcaster in the Hall of Fame library. And the game I gave him was a St. Paul Saints game against the Thunder Bay Whiskey Jacks. It was a Northern League playoff game, which we won on a walk-off home run. It was a very crisply played and crisply broadcast game, which is why I gave it to Jeff Idelson, and they put it in the Hall of Fame library. So those are the two games I know they've got.
And Don, it's very interesting because, Matt Noakes was the one who, hit that home run. And I love Matt Noakes as a catcher. He used to sit with the Yankees. He used to sit with Hondo there, Frank Howard. And he would just, you could just see Howard going on and on. Matt Noakes would just, listen up. And it was just, all these stories and stuff. What I really want to get into is how did you travel with the team and, what was life like on the road as a baseball announcer?
Yeah, starting with New Britain, we went on the bus everywhere that the team went. The first couple of years, Jim Lucas, my play-by-play partner, and myself and Gizmo, the radio dog, my seeing eye dog, would pile into Jim's car. He had a crappy little Ford Tempo, and we would drive all over the Florida State League. And that was practical in Florida, barely, but it would not be practical in the Eastern League. At that time, the Eastern League went from Portland, Maine, down to Bowie, Maryland, and that would have been just impractical for us. So we got an agreement from the team that we could ride the bus, including Gizmo, the radio dog, and so we traveled by bus for all those years that we were in the Eastern League, and it was a very, very interesting, life. There was all those movies on the bus. In 1995, our manager was Sal Butera, and Sal brought along the entire Ken Burns baseball series, and over a number of road trips, we watched all 9 episodes of the Ken Burns baseball series. And I think Jim and I and the coaches and Sal got the biggest kick out of that. And Sal's son, Drew Butera, was in the recent World Baseball Classic, I might add.
Wow, how do you like that?
There was, of course, motels all over the Eastern League, and we'd had some motel exposure in Florida. And in Florida, it seemed like there was a Denny's by every motel that we stopped at in the Florida State League. In the Eastern League, there was quite a variety. We got clam chowder in Portland. We got crabs in Bowie in Maryland. We went to London, Ontario in 1993. What is now the Trenton franchise was in London. That was their final year. And and we got to drink Labatt's Canadian beer and Molson Canadian beer, the stuff they don't import into America. They make one brew for Canadian drinkers and one brew for American drinkers. And what they make up in Canada is way better than what you can get down here under the same name. And one night in London, Ontario, we had a few too many, and Jim and I hijacked the elevator in our hotel. Because the hotel had it had a voice. That was the thing. It was a talking elevator. And neither of us had our girlfriends around. We nicknamed the elevator voice Beautiful Betty. And we hijacked it. We just listened to the voice go, floor number 19, floor number 18, floor number 17. And, of course, we were laughing like loons. So, you get a few Molson Canadians under your belt, and that can happen.
You know what I like, Don? And I know because, I do live near Pawtucket. But what I found out about doing my research on the minor league teams, I don't know if it was present back then, but it's certainly present now with a huge upsurge of people going to the minor leagues because of the cost of Major League Baseball. You can go to a minor league baseball game, enjoy a whole family outing for about $30, and the food's cheaper. But this is what I've learned. Every ballpark in the minor leagues, has their own local flavor of food and beer and stuff that's going on, say in Connecticut or in Maryland or in Canada. Did you find that back then?
If it wasn't at the ballparks, it certainly was at the hotels. We would try to, I wouldn't on purpose say, is there a good local beer in this area? And we'd be in Binghamton or we'd be in Albany, and we'd drink Saranac in Albany, and we'd drink Molson Canadian in London. There were different things in different cities, and it might or might not have been at the ballparks. I don't really know because we didn't go to the concession stands in the different ballparks. We really concentrated on our broadcast. It really wasn't possible to get, a whole lot to eat at the ballparks with us, working on the broadcast the way we were doing.
And let me ask you this. What did you like most about doing these games?
The time when we were on the air, when the red light was on, whether it was a real red light or whether it was figurative, and it was all real, we were broadcasting. That was easily the best part. That is so much of an ego boost to be on the air, to know that there's people listening on the radio and later on the internet. And when we were with Charleston, our last team, we made quite an effort to get people who were listening on the internet to email us, and we would read emails on the air when things got dull, as they often did. I mean, let's face it, baseball, moves at a slow pace compared to basketball or hockey. And baseball, if you don't have stories to tell, then you look into, the emails. And today, if we were broadcasting, we would have people, tweeting to us, and we'd read tweets that we got over Twitter, or we'd read Facebook messages. That's what would go on today if we were doing this.
And let me ask you this, Don. I'm not going to get into the reasons why you gave it up. You gave it up. You were about 39 years old. You gave it up for reasons. I know it didn't pay as much. It probably still doesn't, like we mentioned before the show. Do you miss it? Do you miss that kind of excitement? I mean, now that you're in your 50s, do you still want to go back on those buses, go to the Waffle Houses, and just have a great time at the ballpark?
I tell you what, I don't miss the buses, not one bit, and I don't miss the Waffle Houses. Waffle House it was a very unique restaurant. If you don't live in the South, you probably don't know about Waffle House. But if you go there and you eat a full meal, you leave hungrier than you were when you went in. That's an exclusive thing to the Waffle House. Now, but I don't miss the travel, and I don't miss the pounding away on the Braille machine. There is a device called the Braille printer, but no team I was with would kick in the $4,000 that a Braille printer costs, and I certainly didn't have it. So I did everything manually, and I did not have a blind intern to do my braille work so that I could concentrate on broadcasting. So it was all a do-it-yourself operation. I don't miss that part of it, but I do miss those, hours on the air. I miss, the back and forth with Jim, him doing the play-by-play and myself doing the color. Although once I got caught, I fell into the trap of becoming the baseball fan rather than the broadcaster. And this was in the Northern League. We were with St. Paul. We were facing Sioux Falls. And the pitcher was Steve Howe. And he had been a major leaguer. He had had multiple drug problems. And he was trying to make his way back and work his way for one more try. And he was facing Dwight Smith of our team. And Dwight Smith, again, was looking to make a comeback. He had been in the National League. He'd been a Rookie of the Year once. And now he was a father with a son who would come to the ballpark. And this duel between Steve Howe and Dwight Smith, I got caught listening to Jim as a fan and forgetting that I was supposed to pull my weight as a color commentator. And it's a miracle it only happened once that I remember in 12 years.
And let me ask you this, Don. Do you think that, with the technology we have today, that maybe if you're not going to go back into broadcasting, having like a podcast show or something that can, work for your love of baseball?
Well, I've gotten into a couple of ventures. For one thing, I write a blog, and that's called Baseball As I See It. What people have to do is have to put the dash in between each word, baseball dash as dash I dash C dash it, baseballasIseeIt.com. And when I don't do a full column, I write short bits in a club on Facebook, which is also called Baseball As I See It. And further, I got the idea when the column got started, when the blog began back in August of 2015, I got the idea, well, why don't I write a book about my experiences, first growing up in loving baseball as a kid, growing up blind, and then my 12 years behind the microphone. And why don't I call that book Baseball As I Saw It? Well, that book has been in production ever since, and I do have an editor lined up, and when I have a full manuscript ready, I'm going to send it to Colorado where this editor is, and supposedly it'll go on from there. They'll see to the publication of the book as well as the editing.
Let me ask you this. When do you think the book will be coming out?
I honestly don't know, because it's a very long process. I'm also trying to find a job, so I have to focus on that. And if I do find a job, I'll be doing the book evenings and weekends. So it could be a while before Baseball As I Saw It actually is available. It'll be an ebook when it is. It won't be on the shelves. It'll be an ebook.
And what you're going to have to do, Don, is when you do get it, and if you want to come back on the show, I'd be more than delighted to have you on the show. I thought this was a very powerful interview. You were very, very blunt on a lot of the questions I asked, which makes for a great learning experience for the folks at home. How'd you enjoy it today? You've been in radio all these years. Did you like the interplay, the chemistry? What'd you think?
Very definitely. This was a lot of fun. I would do this again in a heartbeat. And, of course, it'll be in my Facebook group, Baseball As I See It. I doubt the column will still be up by then. This could be several years in the future. If I ever get a job, the column is going to close down, and all that'll be left is the Facebook group, Baseball As I See It, and then the work on the book. Because you can't do all that many projects while you're doing a 40-hour work week.
No, it's tough. I mean, I worked 100 hours a week when I was a big tax lawyer, and diabetes was getting worse, and my health was getting worse. I didn't see my family, so I know what the grind is. By the way, why don't you tell the people out home what are you looking for in work?
Well, got out of baseball, I got into customer service at Alamo Rent-A-Car. They had a national call center in Goose Creek, South Carolina. And Goose Creek is only a little bit to the west of Charleston, which is where I was living anyway. So I did that for 5 years. I would never have voluntarily left, but they closed the call center in Goose Creek. So when that closed, there was really no way to continue. And I've been in customer service in one way or another when I've been working ever since then. I've either been doing customer service or I've been out of work. And I was injured in January of 2015, and that cost me my job at Blue Cross in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. And although the physical therapy has been over since July, that hasn't convinced any employers in Jersey that I'm fit to employ.
Well, I'll tell you what, where could folks who listen to the show who might know of people or who might have job openings here, because a lot of people listen to this show, give you a contact?
Well, I can be reached by email at Wardlows, WARDLOWS 97 at bellsouth.net. I can be emailed with questions about, baseball. If you wanna chat about the subject, or if you have anything job related, if you just wanna get to know the story a little bit better, I can be contacted, as well as you can join the club on Facebook, Baseball As I See It. For the Facebook group, you don't have to put the dashes in between the words. You can just look it up as Baseball As I See It. And if people join the club, you're welcome.
Yeah, which I'm a part of it, and I know it's a very good page. Hold the line, Don. This is how I end the show. Folks, it was a pleasure having Don here today to talk about his experience in baseball and him growing up with a handicap. I hope you thoroughly enjoyed the show. Give Don an email. Let him know that something's out there for him. I'll plug for him as well. My co-captain should be back next week, Eric Weiss. He's running around, like I mentioned earlier, in Arizona. And as always, folks, I'm Ian Kahanowitz, in for for Marc Weiss, and of course, Don Wardlow, and in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good night, folks. Good luck. We'll see you next time.